Have you ever spent time in a foreign country where it was not just foreign to you, the language maybe was foreign, but the customs, the practice, everything that went on around was completely and entirely foreign to you? I remember in 2013 when I went to Russia and I spent about 16 days there, how utterly foreign everything seemed to be. Though the people had a similar skin tone to me, the language was nothing like I had ever known. I was lost. I found myself over and over finding that there were behaviors and actions that I didn't understand. The niceness of being a Canadian was actually perceived to be a passivity on my part, and that Russians would be very assertive at certain points. There was a certain moroseness in terms of even the worship that I experienced, and a sorrow that had come out of an experience from the Cold War, from the suffering of the former Soviet era, and that had not really been removed or changed since perestroika under Gorbachev. There had been so many experiences while I was there that it was quite disorienting. I found myself at times utterly in confusion. I remember it was 3 a.m. when my plane landed at Nizhny Novgorod, and I got off the plane, and everybody rushed off the plane quickly, and I had no idea what was going on. I was the last one off the plane into the bus, the last one off the bus, only to discover that they all knew that they needed to rush to get into line to clear customs, which would take about an hour and a half before I would clear the customs. When I finally got to the customs booth, that old Soviet-style booth, there was just gray, big lights shining down on me. There was a person standing in front of me behind a glass. They didn't speak a word. I gave them my passport, and they disappeared. And I didn't know what was going on. There's nothing more vulnerable feeling than you've just surrendered your very government documentation to someone who disappears. And then they came back, and they pointed to where I could go. Next would come probably my most disorienting experience in all of my time there. I had brought little bottles of maple syrup to give to my hosts. And when my bags had been scanned, they had been flagged. And as a result of my bags being flagged, I had to explain to someone who did not speak English what all of these little bottles were, full of this substance. Now, if you've ever played charades, try and do charades to explain maple syrup. It's very difficult. And in the midst of this, I couldn't explain it, but finally they could tell that I was just some poor, innocent Canadian who didn't know what he was doing. And I met my other companion who I was traveling with, and off we went. Over and over, I found that I would be in situations where I was completely disoriented. I was lost. Showing up at a hotel, surrendering my passport, which was the standard practice in Russia, that you surrender your passport everywhere you go so that the government knows where you are, that they track your every movement. Finding that at one time that I was on the train and suddenly 2 men show up and take my bags. And all of a sudden, I'm supposed to just follow them. I have no idea who these people are, but I was told, someone will come, take your bags, and you follow them. You talk about having to trust. There's this enormous sense of trust when you don't speak a word, when they don't speak a word of English, you can't communicate. It's entirely disorienting. I was so grateful when I finally had a translator. And when I would have a translator with me, I felt really at ease. Until my translator, when I was sitting at a dinner, my translator, she left me and went off to get more food, and I was sitting there when suddenly a woman got up on the platform and began to sing and started going around in the auditorium asking people various questions. And I had no idea what was going on. I was afraid that I was suddenly going to be approached by this woman and be asked something that I didn't know what. And the only thing that I could really say in Russian was "Chorny chai, pajalsta," which means "more green tea, please." She was an entertainer, and she was asking about what things cause you to feel in love. Apparently, if I had answered, it would have been more green tea. So I was grateful when my translator returned. You see, when you go into a culture where you have no idea about the practices and the customs, when the language is foreign to you, You can find yourself not only disoriented, but confused and making judgments and casting aspersions upon people because you don't have any frame of reference to really understand someone. In all of that, what happens is that we step into a world that is utterly foreign to us. And if it were not for a translator, we would be entirely lost. In John chapter 1, what we have is the greatest translator who has come to help us to overcome the greatest cultural barrier that has ever existed. We are told that the Word was made flesh. This Word that had existed before all time, the Word that was in the beginning, the Word that was with God, the Word that was God, the Word that knew all things, had come into earth, we are told in John chapter 1, verse 14, was coming in flesh, and He was coming to translate the very things of heaven. He was coming to translate for us the language, the practice, the behaviors of heaven. God sent His very own Son into the world because He knew that the ways of heaven are so utterly foreign to you and me that unless someone would come and translate and give us help in understanding what it is that heaven is all about, that we would have that xenophobia, that we would judge culture, the culture of heaven, by our own practice and by our own standards. And so the Word became flesh, and what is it that Jesus translates to us? In this, I want us to see from John 1:14, just this one verse this morning, what Jesus comes to translate for us. Two things. Two very simple things that I want us to see. That what Jesus translates for us is that we could see, first of all, that God has drawn near. God has drawn near. What is so amazing to me is that when John speaks about Jesus, he calls Him the Word. You see that throughout chapter 1. It starts in chapter 1, verse 1, and it takes us all the way back to in the beginning when God created, back to Genesis. But it's more than just Genesis that's being translated to us. God is translating to us all of His work that He has ever done. He is communicating to us by His very own Son the practices of heaven. And so it's no surprise that when Jesus comes, He comes as the translator, not just a translator, but the translator of heaven. And He comes to translate all of heaven's practices and cultures and behavior and all of the ways of God and all of the purposes of God, because God is so utterly different than us. He is so foreign to us. His ways are not our ways. His thoughts are not our thoughts, that we need someone to come and translate to us the very practice of heaven. And so John calls Him the Word, the Logos, the reasoning, the understanding, the logic of heaven. Because to us, the logic, the reasoning, the understanding, the thinking of heaven is completely foreign. It's a language that we do not understand. It's a language that we can't comprehend. It's behaviors that are so utterly different to us that we would judge them as evil and wicked if someone did not come and translate it to us. And so the Word was made flesh, we are told. Jesus was sent to us because the ways of God's life and grace and glory are completely foreign to us. We are so familiar in a world and a culture of death that the way of life of Jesus is completely foreign. This is going to be increasingly an issue that Christians have to address in our world as the expansion of medical assistance in dying just continues to move forward, as questions about how the practice of assisted death is being carried out. That Christians are going to find themselves at odds with a culture of death when we know the culture of life. The culture of life that God enables us is that every life from conception to natural death is a gift of God. But in a world where we are unfamiliar with grace, where grace is so foreign to us, where you have to prove your identity, prove your worth, prove your value, that we live in a world that your existence is justified now by how much you can offer. That the good that you can contribute to society even includes the good that you can do by ending your life early. That this is a lack of grace, that we don't understand the value of life, we don't understand the value of grace, and we don't understand the value of glory. That God has bestowed glory upon humanity, made in His image, made in His likeness. And so God has revealed Himself. He has come near because His ways are so foreign to us. They're completely different. They're completely different, so the Word has to come and translate, but not just translate. The Word comes as flesh and blood. The Word comes as flesh and blood, John tells us, fully God, yet fully humanity, all embracing all of the glory of God, and yet at the same time embracing all of the limitations of being a human, so that we would know what God is like. That if God did not show up on the scene in flesh and blood, that we would not understand His ways. We would not understand life, grace, and glory. We're so comfortable in a world and a culture of sin and death that we have to prove ourselves, that over and over we fail to appreciate what God has done in Jesus. The very fact, though, that God has come near, we're told in John 1:14 that the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. And this idea of a perfect, holy, pure, and sinless God walking, talking, dwelling with us, that He would draw near to imperfect, sinful, impure people, is utterly foreign. It's not just that we didn't understand God, that we needed a translator. John actually says in the verses prior to this that he came to His own people, he says in John 1:12, but His own people did not receive Him. They hated the ways of life. They hated the ways of grace. They hated the ways of glory. But because they did not understand, and not only not understand, but hate the ways of God, the Word came and dwelt among us. Now, this language here that John uses when he says the Word was made flesh and it dwelt, and He dwelt among us, John uses this language. One translation puts it as, and He took up residence with us. Now, I'm a camping lover. It's been a while, but I love getting out into the wilderness. It literally is, and He pitched His tent. The Word became flesh, and He pitched His tent in the wilderness. That He set up His tent and put down the tent pegs, and He established a residence here. And this takes us back to the story of Exodus. That if we're familiar with the Exodus, that God's people traveled and lived and dwelt in tents when they left Egypt until they got to the Promised Land. There had been this period of 40 years where God's people dwelt and lived in tents. And God was so gracious to His people that He would come and He would live in a tent with His people. That He would put His tent smack dab in the middle of the 12 tribes of Israel. That He would dwell right there in what would be called the tabernacle, a portable worship center. And John picks up this idea of the tabernacle when he says, and the Word became flesh and He tabernacled. He put His tent among us. And this is what God has done. He's come so near that He's camping in the wilderness with His people as He takes them from slavery to the Promised Land. And John tells us that Jesus has come and He's pitched His tent with us as He takes us out of slavery to the Promised Land. All in this one little word. And the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. And from this, what we see is that God would dwell with His people. But the thing was, when Israel was in the wilderness, when Israel had God's tent pitched right in the middle of their midst, they could only go in and see God, one person on one day of year. One person, a high priest, on the Day of Atonement, one day a year, who would offer up sacrifices so that they could atone and be forgiven of sin, and that they could go and bring the prayers of the people before God, and that they could make intercession before God. But now John says that the Word became flesh and He dwelt among us. And it's not just that we have Him in our midst, but only accessible one day a year. But the second thing that John tells us is that we don't only see that God has drawn near, but we see glory. He says, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son of the Father, full of grace and truth. And what John does here is he's telling us, he's answering really for us the question, what does glory look like? We think we know what glory looks like. We think that glory looks like the spectacular. It looks like fire falling from the sky. It looks like this revelation of the heavens. It looks like something spectacular, like a pyrotechnic show. John actually wants to tell us, by connecting Jesus to the Exodus story, that the Word becoming flesh and dwelling among us and showing glory is far more radically ordinary and superior to what formerly was shown. He says to us that we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. And in this John is packing in loads of information from the Exodus story. He's packing in all sorts of ideas. He kind of tweaks our minds to the Exodus story by saying the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. And that ought to trigger all of the memories of Exodus, from Exodus 32 onwards to the end of Exodus 40, where God pitches his tent, dwells among his people, his glory is manifested, shows up in fire, consuming, coming in so that not even any person, not even Moses, could enter into the tabernacle. He tells us two things specifically that point us back to the glory of the old tabernacle and how the glory of Jesus is far superior. He says, first of all, that we all have seen his glory. Now, in the Old Testament, specifically in the incidents where God had revealed his glory in the tabernacle, what had happened was that at first, God had given the 10 Commandments to the people of Israel. Moses was instructed to take it, told the people of it. He went back up on the mountain. He etched the words in stone, the very handwriting of God on the stone tablets. And as Moses descended from the mountain, we're told in Exodus 32, as he came down, he heard loud cries and shouts and whooping and celebration and partying. And what he found was Israel breaking the commandments of God. In Exodus 32, we're told that as Moses came down the mountain, that the people had asked Aaron to give them the God who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. And so Aaron had fashioned a golden calf. The golden calf, the Egyptians had worshipped calves. And so Moses had fashioned the golden calf, and he had said, "Here, Israel, is Yahweh your God who brought you out of Egypt. Worship him." And so the people had begun to bow down, and they were having orgies, and there was all sorts of fornication going on and drunkenness, all sorts of disobedience and rebellion. And when Moses comes down from the mountain and he sees what's going on, he smashes the tablets of the covenant. He doesn't just drop them and go, "Oops, I broke the tablets." He takes them and he smashes them, is the indication of the Hebrew, to give the sense that Israel had broken the very covenant of God. Israel had disobeyed the commandments of God. That from top to bottom, they had broken the full list of everything that God had commanded. And so God was speaking to Moses saying, "I'm done with this people. I'm going to smite them off of the face of the earth." And in Exodus 33, Moses begins to plead with God, "Lord, if you destroy this people, the nations will mock you. They're going to revile your name because they'll say, he could bring them out of Egypt, but he couldn't take his people into the promised land. What kind of God is their God?" So Moses pleads with God, "Won't you go with us?" To which God says, "I'll go with you, but I won't go with this people." And Moses continues to plead, and he does something extraordinary in Exodus 33:18. He says, "Lord, show me your glory." And the Lord relents from his anger, and he puts Moses in the cleft and a hole of a rock, and he covers his hand and he says, "You will see the backside of my glory, but my face you will not see, because if you see my face, on the day that you see my face, you will surely die." And so as the Lord goes by, he covers Moses with his hand, and Moses can just see the back of the train of his robe, and he cries out, the Lord cries out, and he says, the Lord, a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, whose anger will not always chide, but he will remember his promises to his people, to the 1,000th generation. And so in Exodus 34, verses 5 through 7, this is what the Lord says. But now Jesus shows up, and he doesn't cover our faces so that we can't see him. He shows up in flesh and blood, and people look at the very face of God and live. They don't die. There's no hiding of glory, but there is. Charles Wesley would put it this way in his hymn, "Hark the Herald Angels Sing." He would say, "Veiled in flesh the Godhead see." The God is still hidden, but he's hidden in flesh and blood. And for those who have faith to see and eyes of faith, that they would see the very face of God. They would see the very face of God in a human being. But there's more to it than just not only seeing the face of God, but what glory looks like is actually very rooted in those words when John says, "And we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only from the Father, full of grace and truth." Those two words, grace and truth, are John's way of connecting us right back to Exodus 34, verses 5 through 7, when the Lord had said that he is a God who is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. That when the translators of the Greek Old Testament took those words, they translated it this way. They said, the Lord God, who is compassionate and merciful, patient and very gracious and truthful." And Moses was hearing the very voice of God who was saying that he was gracious and compassionate, gracious and truthful. And John records those words, "We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, full of grace and truth," which connects us to the Exodus story. And we need the broad context of the Exodus story, because what we need to understand is that in the context of Exodus, when God says that he is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, that he is full of grace and truth, what he's saying is that even though Israel broke covenant, even though Israel disobeyed all of the commands, he is faithful and true to his word. That God always keeps his word. He always keeps covenant. He is always faithful. He will never break his word. And he is gracious. Because in the context of Exodus, what we have are sinful people who've broken God's covenant. They've disobeyed the law. And what does God say? I will be gracious, and I'll be truthful to my word. And what God does is he takes his people from Egypt into the promised land. And now, John says, there is a greater revelation of glory. And it's ordinary, and it is far superior to that which was shown to Moses. It's ordinary in that it looks like flesh and blood. But it's even greater than Moses, because what Jesus comes to do is he comes to a covenant-breaking people like you and me, people who have disobeyed the very commands of God. And what does he do? He says, I will forgive your iniquities and remember them no more. I will take you out of the house of slavery, and I will take you all the way to the promised land. I will take you from the land where you were suffering and where you were beaten down by sin, and I will take you all the way home to the promised land where there is milk and honey forever. And what God is promising in Jesus is far superior than what Moses was offered. What Moses was offered was taking a people out of Egypt and into a physical land. But what Jesus does, John tells us, is that he takes us out of the bondage of sin and death and the culture of death, and he takes us all the way to heaven, which is why he is the Word who translates what God is doing. He's translating everything that God is doing. He's translating to us the behaviors of Jesus. He's translating to us what God has come to show us is how he has come to rescue us. Because what glory looks like, is something far superior. Glory heals. Glory saves. Glory restores. Glory loves. Glory gives life. And glory rescues. We are so foreign to the ideas of grace and truth that we think that we can stand and vindicate ourselves in self-righteous postures and thinking that we are doing the right thing and judging others and standing in condemnation, when what we ought to display is the glory of grace and truth that God has displayed in Jesus. It's so foreign to us that we need God in very flesh to show us what it looks like to be forgiven, what it means to restore, what it means to heal. We're so familiar in living with broken relationships and justifying brokenness in a world of death that we fail to understand that what the dawning glorious light comes to do is to show us that our thoughts are not like his thoughts and his ways are not like our ways. And when Isaiah says those words in Isaiah 55 verses 8 and 9, he's not talking about God is incomprehensible to you. He is talking about how I hadn't planned on going here, but let's go here to Isaiah 55. What Isaiah is talking about when he speaks about glory being revealed, about thoughts not being like God's thoughts, and God's ways not being like our ways, in Isaiah 55:9, verses 8 and 9, what precedes it is this, verse 6. Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake his way and the unrighteous man his thoughts. Let him return to the Lord that he may have compassion on him, and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon. The way of God that is not like our way is that we want performance. We want people to measure up. We want people to perform in such a way that they prove themselves. And what Jesus comes to do is to say, my way isn't like that. My way is the way of grace. My way, the way of glory, is the way of forgiving, pardoning iniquity, having compassion. And this is what is so utterly foreign to us, which is why Jesus comes and he translates heaven to us. He comes near to us and he keeps his promise and he abounds. This is Exodus 34, verses 5 through 7. What does he abound in? Anger? Wrath? Judgment? No. What he abounds in is grace and truth. What he abounds in is unrelenting mercy. That what flows most naturally from his heart, Thomas Goodwin would say this, so the great Puritan thinker, he would say, what naturally flows from his heart is compassion and mercy and grace. And so in a world of death, in a world of performance, in a world of judgment, in a world where you have to always demonstrate your value, Jesus comes and he brings life and grace and glory. And it looks very ordinary, but very supernatural. And so, do you feel like you're out of place in the world as a Christian? Christianity should feel out of place. Do you feel like you don't fit as a Christian? It should feel like you don't fit. Because what God has done is when He brings the Word made flesh and dwells among us, He gives you His light and life so that you might become a translator of the very things of God. That you might display to the world grace and truth. That you might understand that the great work of forgiveness that God shows has come to you so that you might extend it to others. You see, He comes near to you, and God knows it takes an entire lifetime to work out and translate and help you to understand the culture of heaven. And He is patient with you. He is so patient with you that He will take your entire life to help you to understand grace and truth. And then, even then, He will translate you from the ordinary to the extraordinary, because it takes a miracle of glorification for us to be adopted into the culture of grace and glory. You see, it takes grace and truth in our lives so that we might come to know all of these blessings. And when these blessings come, Isaac Watts would say it this way in Joy to the World: He comes to make His blessings known far as the curse is found. And we are called not to be those who stand as those who are in righteous judgment in this world, but as those who are ministers first and foremost as agents of grace. That we might display to a world that is so foreign and unfamiliar with the ways of heaven, that we might translate grace and truth, just as God has sent His very own Son to translate it for you and me. That we look to Jesus, that we see Him. And when we see Him, what we discover is that the one who came is the one who came that just as light shone in the darkness, and the darkness could not overcome it, so He comes to you and to me. And as He comes to you and me, that we might know of His grace and truth, that we also might then extend that to a needy world with grace and glory and goodness. As we do that, what we discover is that others who are so desperately needy for grace and truth, even those who might hate it and despise it, that they would discover grace and truth themselves so that they might also walk in it. We didn't get to do this last night. I missed Christmas Eve with you all. At the end of each of your rows, you'll find a basket full of candles. And I invite you to just take that, pick it up, and hand it on. Parents, I would ask that you use your discretion with your kids. I trust that we will not burn down the place full of glory. But on that night, when Jesus broke into the world, a star that shone, it shone the light to give us the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. And that light isn't something that we hold on to. That light isn't something that we keep for ourselves. Grace and truth is so desperately needed in this world that He calls us to pass that on. And as we pass that on, we pass it on as those who have experienced moving from death to life, out of darkness into light, from performance to grace, so that we might share His light and life. Let's stand, and we're going to sing about the God who has brought us joy into this world.